Today on No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin, remembering the Right Honourable Brian Mulroney. Now, I grew up in a Canada that had every advantage in the world, which of course we resolutely refused to take advantage of. We had an inferiority complex. We resented our more confident neighbors to the south, and we kept out foreign investment, choking off our own potential growth. There were domestic battles like the National Energy Program and whether Ottawa could take over Alberta's oil, and there were separatists in Quebec, and our national unity felt under threat. So by 1984, Canadians were ready for a change, and we handed Brian Mulroney the largest majority for a conservative, well, for any political party, any government ever. As he was about to deliver the change we had asked for, of course, he met great resistance, upheaval, controversy. It cost him everything politically. Still, in the end, he transformed our country and perhaps more importantly, our attitudes. He was a leader of consequence. So today on No Nonsense, two people who knew him like few others. Bill Fox, who was a young reporter who met Brian Mulroney when Mulroney co-led the Royal Commission into Crime and Corruption in the construction industry, the Cliche Commission. He and Bill became friends, and Bill went on to serve as a director of communications during Prime Minister Mulroney's first term. And Arthur Milnes, an academic and historian and a writer who worked with Prime Minister Mulroney to craft one of the great political memoirs of our time. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being here today for an up-close and personal assessment of a man who some have called a modern-day founding father. Welcome to you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
It's great. You got a bit of noise going on there in the background, Arthur, but we'll deal with it unless you just have to, get up and tell them to be quiet. Bill, I've got to say, having worked with you over the years as reporters, oh, there he's going to go. He's going to go and tell them to tone it down. But Bill, I want to say I remember the stories that you shared with us and colleagues in the newsrooms about meeting Brian Mulroney. You two always had a very, very strong personal connection. What did you see back then that would explain the man who would become a prime minister with vision, with incredible backbone, his conviction against all odds? Was it there from the beginning?
It was for me. As you mentioned, I was a political correspondent in Quebec and had just been assigned there.
Yeah.
I literally met Brian Mulroney as a consequence of a turnover note. For people who haven't worked in media, back in the days when A, there were newsrooms, and B, there were people in them, when the shift change would occur, the duty editor would write a note to whoever was coming on to take their spot to say, here's what's going on, here's the plan, here's who's been assigned, here's the editor, here's the photography to go with it. And it kind of helped the seamless, decision-making process.
Yeah.
So I was coming in as a very young political reporter in Quebec, as a person who had never lived there, who didn't go to school there,
right.
And apart from the hockey players that I could recognize as a consequence of watching Hockey Night in Canada, I didn't know anybody there. And my predecessor very kindly wrote me a longish note of people, and he said to me, you should get to know these folk right away. And almost at the very top of that list was M. Brian Mulroney. And my predecessor said to me, he's uniquely positioned because as a labor lawyer, he knows all the labor leaders. As an advisor to business, he knows all the business leaders. He's been involved in politics at the provincial level. He's been involved in politics at the federal level. One of his best friends is the president of the Montreal Canadiens. So he's like one-stop shopping for a reporter. Whatever you want to know, he knew something about it. So that's how we met.
Yes, Brian Mulroney was one-stop shopping, that is for sure. Now, we've rearranged Arthur there because he was in this noisy place. But Arthur, when you agreed to work with the Prime Minister on his political story, I don't know whether you planned this, but it turned into a 5-year project. It's detailed, it's great, it's amazingly frank. Few political leaders are that honest and that self-aware. What was it at the core of this man that allowed him to do that?
Well, he was confident. He was confident of his place in history. And he did what I tell young people today about Mr. Mulroney, and particularly the last few weeks. He did big things, really big things for the country and internationally. And he was therefore confident. And he had read political memoirs his entire life since he was a
Yeah.
kid. I loved reading his early early files from the 50s and 60s, and he would order every new book about Sir John A. Macdonald and Wilfrid Laurier, and he knew his stuff. So he knew what a good memoir was, and he wanted to have one. So he sent me into the archives. I was in the archives a full 2.5 to 3 years, and we hardly ever met. You know,
Just,
so
I mean, he had these detailed notes about everything, about meetings and phone calls and encounters. So you were allowed to work off of all of those.
yes, his collection in the Library and Archives Canada, which had never been opened to anybody before,
Yeah.
and it was more than 3,000 boxes. And just the finding aid was a 2,700 page document, both front and back page on both sides of the page. So the day they handed it to me at the archives, I almost went over to the Rideau Canal and jumped in with it. It was pretty daunting.
No kidding. Bill, was that like you saw that, you witnessed that every time something happened?
Well, not only did I, but so did the good people of Saskatchewan from a very early age. Brian, as you know, his first political job was as private secretary to Alvin Hamilton when Alvin was agriculture minister. And he secured that position through Roy Fabish, the legendary Roy Fabish, another Saskatchewan political superstar, based on a long memorandum that Brian had written to the powers that be in the conservative government in Ottawa, outlining in exhaustive detail things that they should do to improve the party's fortunes in Quebec. And when Mr. Hamilton invited him to come and work with him during the campaign, Brian, it was his first time in Saskatchewan, his first time in Western Canada. He was completely kind of dazzled by the geography and the prairie and all of the rest of that. But what is of particular interest is that he phoned in to radio station CKRM in Regina and offered up a little voice report on something that Mr. Hamilton had done. I think it was a speech that he had delivered, and then volunteered to do that at every stop of Mr. Hamilton's campaign. And you can appreciate, that baritone of Brian's, literally. And I think the direct quote was something like, "This is Brian Mulroney reporting for CKRM." And he was so effective at it that he literally was offered a job at the end of the campaign by the radio station, as the station manager put it, in case that law thing doesn't work out for you.
Yeah, in case that law degree. But Arthur, that was the point. Like he was a, I don't know, consummate, yes, but almost uncontrollable storyteller. Like you couldn't
Well, how
walk
do you think
past
I
them.
felt? I had 5 years of stories one-on-one. It was the ride through history of my life. And thankfully, he was Irish, so he could tell a really good story.
Right.
And but to what Bill was saying about Saskatchewan, when I don't even know if Alvin Hamilton would have known this, but when his young assistant, Brian Mulroney, was in the office, he decided to fire off a 5-page memo to the Diefenbaker, to the prime minister himself, telling Diefenbaker everything he was doing wrong in French Canada.
So self-confidence was never an issue.
Never a problem. No.
Apparently. But I mean, Bill, this kind of goes back to my first question to you, like this, like he had a plan. Is this one of the stories where way back in Baie-Comeau, he was going to be the Prime Minister of Canada? Like, why would you set out and see your life that way taking notes, remembering, sending emails or letters, not emails, to the Prime Minister of Canada saying, you're doing it all wrong.
Well, I would say two things. First, when I mentioned the experience as a very young staffer in Saskatchewan, part of it was an education for him.
Yeah.
A wheat farm in the prairie and a paper mill town, not one and the same.
Right.
But his core takeaway from that was, these differences notwithstanding,
Yeah.
the common challenges of people trying to make a living, trying to get by, whether you're on a farm working a section or whether you're in a paper mill in Baie-Comeau, Quebec. And he never lost sight of that. And one of the absolute magic moments for me, and I was a reporter and was there covering this,
Yeah.
was during the leadership campaign, the first one he ran in 75, 76, where he was not successful.
Yeah.
But there was an event in Baie-Comeau, and literally everybody from his kindergarten class to colleagues of his late dad from the mill were all out there. And at a certain point in his speech, Brian just looked at the crowd and he said, "It's a great country when the son of an electrician can aspire to the highest elected office of the land."
Yeah.
And for me, that crystallized what that generation was all about. Many of us came from smaller communities.
Yeah.
Many of us came from, resource-based towns. Many of us had parents who did hard physical work to provide for their families. But the opportunity and the aspiration was, there were opportunities around education. There were opportunities to pursue other careers. And to me, that day when he said that, I really felt like he spoke for our whole generation.
Yeah.
That fundamentally, that's what our parents were about, and that's what we were about.
Well, and that's when that was still the case, where every parent quite rightly thought if they worked hard enough and sacrificed enough, their kids would do better than they had.
Yeah.
And that's what motivated them.
Yeah.
And that's what he was. So Arthur, you must have sensed that too and seen it in the notes about what motivated him, what drove him.
Well, one thing I found particularly powerful was when he went off to St. FX University in Nova Scotia, and that's a long way from Baie-Comeau.
Yeah.
That's for sure. And he did his honors thesis in 1959. It was called "The Politics of Quebec," and I sat there in the archives reading it. And I grew up like most that we were sort of taught that the only person in Quebec thinking about the Constitution in the early 60s and late 50s was Professor Trudeau, Pierre Trudeau. Well, here in this thesis written in Antigonish, Nova Scotia, there was the Meech Lake Accord in 1959. And another incredible thing he did with that, there were very few books in the St. FX library on this topic, the politics of Quebec. So he went out and he wrote to the decision and opinion makers across Quebec and Canada. And one of my favorite letters, I opened this file one day and there was this handwritten letter, and it started off, "Dear Mr. Mulroney," and it congratulated him on the topic he had chosen. And the letter went on to give some suggestions to this student, Brian Mulroney, about what he should read, etc. And then the man also told him to check out some of his own articles, and it was signed Professor Pierre Elliott Trudeau, wow. 1959.
Yeah. Well, it does say something about that, the nature of the times too, when, I mean, of course, probably neither one of them thought they would be crossing paths later on, but that commitment to country, Bill, which is what you're referencing there, and looking, everybody knew there were problems. Kid in Saskatchewan, we knew there were problems and issues that had to be wrestled, and that those two were reaching out to one another in that situations just speaks volumes about what politics and generosity was like then as opposed to what we see now.
Yeah. And as part of that, I mean, when you come from that kind of a background, and again, whether it's a farm in Saskatchewan
Yeah.
or a paper mill in Quebec. You're no stranger to hard work.
Yeah.
And as Arthur learned over 5 years, one of the things the world maybe underappreciated about Mr. Mulroney was his work ethic.
Yeah.
The second was his strategic discipline. He always had a plan. And he understood that if you wanted things to happen in November of 1988, you had to have made certain decisions in May of 1986, or it wouldn't happen.
Yeah.
And the final point I'd make is his determination. And I'll tell you a quick story about that. So it's 1985. Chernenko, who was running in the Soviet Union at the time, dies. There's a lying in state. There's the selection of a new Soviet leader, a fellow named Gorbachev. All of the leaders of the world are there. Everybody wants to obviously meet this new person who we couldn't have known that day, but was, going to bring in perestroika and everything else.
Right. Okay.
So we asked for a meeting. Our officials at External Affairs make their representation. And then they come back and they say, they'd love to see you. Mr. Gorbachev's actually been to Canada again for agriculture.
Right.
But it's not looking like it's going to be possible at this time. So Brian looks and he says, we're going to get that meeting, right? So we send people back and they make further representation, and it's still looking like the answer might not be yes. At which point we're standing in a hotel suite, and he laughs and he says to me, "Where do you think the hidden microphones are that the KGB have installed?" So I laugh and I say, "I don't know. They're usually in the the lamp shade or the the overhead lamp." So with a big smile, he walked right over to the overhead lamp, stood underneath it, and in very loud tones said, "Now listen, Bill, they need to understand we aren't leaving here until we see Gorbachev." And sure enough, not very long later, I found myself walking up the steps of the Kremlin to go to a meeting with Mr. Gorbachev and Andrei Gromyko.
So the word determined, Arthur, might emerge from time to time.
Yeah, he put his eye on the ball as a young man, and off he went. And the other thing about that, I know Bill was privileged to actually be in the room when they met.
Yeah,
in Moscow. I got to
was.
read the note-taker reports, and what I loved was Mr. Mulroney. He addressed Gorbachev not as this superpower leader, not as this communist leader or anything. He addressed him as a fellow politician and a fellow rookie on the scene. And the two of them hit it off quite often. The External Affairs note-taker reports are very dry. And they couldn't resist writing, wow, like External Affairs was surprised. Like, wow, they're speaking to each other like fellow politicos.
Yeah.
So he knew how to talk. He knew how to talk the other guy's talk.
Even after speaking into the light shade. There's been so many things written in the last couple of weeks in the wake of the death of the Prime Minister. There was a great bit of insight in a piece by Jeff Norquay, who also worked, like Bill, for the Prime Minister. He cites a speech to the Albany Club in 2015, where Prime Minister Mulroney was talking about transactional versus transformative leadership. And Jeff goes on to write that Brian Mulroney was a transformational leader because of his transactional skills. Bill, you've just hinted at this so many times, and you too, Arthur, but the relationships were key. Everything started from relationships, Bill.
Yes, but to a purpose. It wasn't just kind of schmooze. It wasn't just glad handing. It wasn't just a big, attaboy. It was always, if you have a very good relationship with somebody, the likelihood that you can come to some better understanding of each other's position is enhanced immeasurably. And probably the most interesting test of that for me was, as people know, he had an excellent relationship with President Ronald Reagan. And that was at the core of so many things that ended up being to Canada's benefit. The most spectacular example being the free trade agreement.
Exactly.
But there were many other things. But, you know, to me, the real test of that relationship was when Brian, as Prime Minister, had to pick up the phone, call the President of the United States, and say, we, Canada, your NORAD partner and your NATO partner, are not going to be participant in the Strategic Defense Initiative, which at the time was familiar. Remember, it was always referred to as Star Wars.
Yep.
It was the absolute centerpiece of U.S. defense policy.
Yep.
And here was their neighbor, Canada, through its prime minister, telling, you know, Ronald Reagan, we're not going to be part of that. And you have to, you know, if you don't have those kinds of relationships, I don't think you can have those conversations. I don't think it survived.
Yeah.
Well, he was also in that regard. He there's no way he was going to rattle the American colossus just for a good headline. And in that case, as Bill knows, he made sure he phoned President Reagan ahead of the announcement. Made sure that President Reagan knew what his and Canada's position was. And like I said, he gave him a heads up. There was none of this, walking down to the House of Commons and just, shouting this announcement to get a good headline. No, that wasn't how Mr. Mulroney worked.
Well, I'll give you another example, Pam, very quickly. So again, everybody knows about the relationship with President Reagan. So we're in Washington, official visit. We're going to see the president. Number of other bilateral meetings. Mr. Mulroney says, where's the meeting with Vice President Bush? There's a kind of an awkward pause. Everybody explains that the agenda is pretty charged. There's not really a window of opportunity to do that. He will be meeting the Vice President in any number of the other meetings, at which point MBM looks at the Assembly and says to us, we will be going up to Admiralty House, which was the Vice President's residence, for a meeting with Vice President Bush. Just tell me when it is. And sure enough, it happened. And sure
it magically got on the agenda. Yeah.
And then George Bush is president, and now it's another relationship.
Yeah. No, that is really, it was just so key that to everything that he did, but that whole notion of the transactional side of relationships being key to accomplishing what you want to accomplish, Arthur. Like if you want to do something big, you've got to have allies.
Well, one of the things that impressed me most, not so much as a public historian, but as a Canadian, was he latched on to acid rain. He latched on to that when he was leader of the opposition. And I'm the only one who's read every single document in his files. And I can honestly tell you that every single, from 1984 to 1991, actually March 13th, so the anniversary is today, that he signed the acid rain treaty with the Americans. No American official was too high or too low. Every conversation with Brian Mulroney started with acid rain, and it ended with acid rain. And these were congresspersons, these were the vice president, the president, members of the cabinet, and also he was incredibly successful with the American media. He understood the importance of the American media as well in decision-making in the United States. So he put on, that was a remarkable, successful thing, because I would argue fundamentally, the Americans didn't want to sign that treaty. I think they did it to shut him up.
Yeah. To be honest. I think Reagan actually said that visiting Ottawa at one point, which is whatever he wants.
well, to reinforce Arthur's point, I was attendant at a meeting in one of the situation rooms in the White House, the ones down below where they go if things go sideways. And we were barking away about acid rain. And at one point, President Reagan's national security advisor got so frustrated, he literally leapt to his feet, threw his pen down on the table, and started bellowing about, what is it about you people with acid, and guess what? Like, we're not leaving this room till we get an agreement. Was because the answer.
Well, nowhere and on no issue was this greater than with the free trade agreement. I just read the other day that last year Mexico became the United States' biggest trading partner, surpassing Canada and China. Um, this is kind of difficult for us all because we look back at that time. Um, Brian Mulroney risked everything on this gamble. He understood what it meant. And God knows there were a lot of us in the media saying, what are you doing? This is crazy talk. And he persevered and he persevered. Where did you see that, Arthur, first emerge in his thinking that this was going to get done come hell or high water?
Oh, early on, I noticed some notes. I could see his thinking develop, to be quite honest, when he was prime minister designate and he was reviewing the Privy Council briefing binders. He made a lot of notations that, as history turned out, those notations, you could see where his mind was, going, particularly with American protectionism. And also, like we mentioned earlier, he was a great student of history.
Yeah.
So he knew that 1911 Sir Wilfrid Laurier reciprocity agreement and that campaign really well. So he knew what he was getting into politically as well. Yet he still did it, which is why I admire him so.
No, Bill. I mean, you were there. This was the fight of his life.
Well, I want to come back to something you mentioned earlier, Pam, when you quoted Jeff Dorquay about the difference between, transformational and transactional, but the transactional can set up the transformational.
Right.
And free trade is kind of a proof point of that.
Yep.
What Brian Mulroney absolutely understood is that the fundamental architecture of Canada's economy had to change.
Yeah.
So there were a whole series of line items around that of particular import and impact in Western Canada: scrapping the National Energy Program, the Energy Accords, moving, headquarters of departments to Regina and to Winnipeg.
Yep.
That was all part of it. Another part of it was the goods and services tax. Not very popular, but to say the least.
Yes, to say the least.
But fundamentally needed in terms of the revenue generating capacity of the national government. And all of that, it was all a seamless whole with free trades. So we decide we need to secure an access to a market.
Yep.
We decide that as a consequence of that, we have this thing called the manufacturer sales tax, which was hidden,
right,
that fundamentally was a 13% albatross around the neck of every Canadian manufacturer trying to sell into the United States. So you had to get rid of that. You had to replace the revenue somehow. So it was all a seamless whole, it was all, and that's why when I talk about Brian Mulroney as strategist, like he saw all of those component parts in their entirety, and he knew how to bring it together.
Yeah,
and he knew, you accumulate political capital to spend it in the great causes of the country, and at that point in our history, he knew there was no greater cause than to kind of fundamentally transforming our economy.
Arthur, this speaks to as Bill says, to risk understatement. These were unpopular things to do. This was also a man who wanted power because he wanted to be able to do these things. Did he truly how did he reconcile the price of leadership being defeat ultimately with the absolute imperative to do this for the sake of his country?
Well, he knew that Canada needed it, but he also knew he had confidence in himself that he had no choice. He had to take us. He had to take us there, and he had the skills to do it. And also, he trusted in his team. He had the team to do it. That's very important as well. And can I go back to the briefing books for a minute?
Sure.
Yeah. So when Bill was talking about, the GST and things, in a great example of actually of bureaucratic penny pinching. Mr. Turner had become prime minister about 8 weeks before Mr. Mulroney. So when he was defeated, they just took the binders off the old briefing books and gave the same briefing books to Brian Mulroney. So there's one point where the clerk, Gordon Osbaldeston, takes about 4 pages to say, basically, the government of Canada is broke. Like there's nothing good you can find in this. And Mr. Turner's written, I got to read these. Mr. Turner in his handwriting, he writes, "Holy F." And he puts exclamation point. So then Mr. Mulroney gets to it. He reads the same thing, and he writes, "Holy F, John's right." Sorry about that. I just
no, it's just great. It's a funny story because that's what always happens, right? In the handover, you go, "Oh my God, it's so much worse than we expected," and you're handing that over. But Bill, that goes back to this core stuff about what drives this man, right? What has driven him through, well, the rags to riches tale, but this, I am going to do this. I am going to, make our country better in spite of the people, many Canadians who opposed it. He kept trying to say, this is for you. This is in your own best interest, whether you know it or not.
Yeah, but it's a bit like the legendary Steve Jobs great line, right? You don't know you want an iPhone till I invent it.
Right. Exactly.
Right? So Brian Mulroney, he understood that the whole debate around free trade on the pro side was largely aspirational. We were trying to convince people that things were going to be better. But that kind of a campaign is always susceptible to what I'll call the yeah but crowd.
Yeah.
Yeah, but what about this? And yeah, but what about that? And, yeah, but what about unemployment insurance? And yeah, but what about, and so those are hard things to advance. But first of all, you need to be strong yourself.
Yeah.
And to reinforce Arthur's point, and you need to be strong enough to surround yourself with strong people.
Yeah.
And then you need to be inclusive but decisive. And in Mr. Mulroney's case, there were 2 expressions of that. First of all, his caucus.
Right.
Direct quote from Brian, their preoccupations were my priorities. Acid rain being a spectacular example. That's Stan Darling writ large.
Yeah.
So he got that part. And then he also understood that he wanted to surround himself with achievers.
Yeah.
He wanted people that like to get things done. And sometimes people thought it was, kind of a little bit of whistling past the graveyard. But, it's the confidence of great leaders of any kind in any discipline. Yeah. It's the hockey player that wants the puck at the end. It's the baseball player that wants to be at bat on the bottom of the ninth.
But you need a team. You need the team.
But you need the team. But you want the ball, kind of, And he was a guy that had confidence to reach out to good people to help him get the things done that he knew he could get done.
Yeah, I was thinking, I'm not crapping on anybody today, but look at his strong ministers. This is a guy who was not scared of having strong, opinionated cabinet ministers who took him on. And one of my favorite letters was early on, was from, you won't surprise either one of you, John Crosbie. And I opened this file, and there's a letter from Crosbie, and it says, "Dear Prime Minister, names a guy like Joe Blow, age 25, from your office, told me today that I am to do this. I refuse to do this until you phone me and tell me personally to do this. Yours sincerely, John Crosbie." Right? And Crosbie won the day. But he was not scared of that from his ministers. He actually wanted that from his ministers, which was very impressive.
But, Arthur, when Arthur mentions Crosbie, that's a very interesting illustration of what we've just been discussing. Think about Newfoundland. The whole of the economy built around cod.
Bingo.
Right.
Brian Mulroney has to decide they're going to shut down the cod fishery.
Yeah.
Right. He then understands they got to do something else. So the Atlantic Energy Accord, and the next thing you know, there's an oil business.
Yeah.
In Newfoundland.
Yeah.
And it fundamentally transforms the economy.
Yeah.
But you got to have the courage on one end to make that hard decision about the cod fishery, and the vision to understand that there's something else that's to be done.
That's the thing. That's the vision part of it. I mean, honestly, and if he hadn't done the free trade agreement, I mean, we'd be the equivalent of a third world country today, right? I mean, we wouldn't be trading with our largest neighbor, and we'd be trying to figure out what to do. So it's that big picture thinking from way back here before anybody else was putting the pieces together.
Mhm.
Yeah. And it extended all the way through the, like, for instance, in foreign policy and international policy.
Yeah.
He believed, his phrase for it was constructive internationalism. So it's not just don't be a member of the Commonwealth, be a member of the Commonwealth that makes alliances with others like Australia and India to lead the campaign to end apartheid in South Africa. Like that's the sequence, right?
Yeah. Well, and the other thing that I just wanted to raise, go ahead and take that, Arthur. It's not a problem. This happens in live everything here, but I wanted to say, because in the days or the immediate hours after the Prime Minister passed away, we heard everybody saying, oh, the controversy, oh, there was scandals, this, he lost ministers, blah, blah, blah. I don't know. I was there reporting on this. That was a time when ministerial responsibility was still a real thing. If something went wrong on your watch, you resigned. That doesn't happen anymore. So of course there were lost ministers at the time. Bill, like that was for real.
Well, I'd make 2 quick points. First of all, he was a great believer in and defender of institutions, including the Westminster traditions of Parliament.
Yeah.
So yes, when there were questions around ministers, they did what the Westminster tradition suggests you must, which is resign and step aside. That was the stuff of headlines. What tended not to make the headline was when the same minister was exonerated and was re-entered into cabinet. And I remember one very, very clearly, a minister, there was some question raised about the election returns in his riding during a general election. So the minister was asked to step aside.
Yeah.
And Mr. Mulroney said to that person, you are going to be exonerated. I know what's going to happen here. The minute you are, the very next day, we will have a swearing in and you will be back in cabinet. So investigation rolls out. Former ministers completely exonerated. We're going to have a swearing in. Problem is, the very next day is a Saturday. Brian says, I don't care. We'll have a swearing in on Saturday. I said the next day. It's the next day.
It's the next day. Yeah.
I was also thinking of younger ministers who got themselves in trouble.
Yeah.
And they had to leave cabinet. But Mr. Mulroney was very forgiving as well in all facets of his life. And he knew that certain ministers might have to go, like a young Jean Charest or Bernie Valcourt, etc. But so they had to go, but he did it in a way that they could come back. He didn't ruin them. And I found that, again, it's one of his incredible connections with his caucus. There's always caucus.
Or hang him out to dry, right? I mean, today we blame everybody and say, oh, it's the speaker's fault. He's gone, or whatever it is. This was, I made this decision. I'll stand by it, right?
Yeah, and you could say he defended too much sometimes.
Yeah.
And that's not a bad legacy.
I want to ask, I want to get into some of the personal stuff in just a moment because the time is flying by here. But I've got to say this as somebody who ended up working in the United States and after 9/11. And honestly, if we had not had the free trade agreement, I don't know what would have happened in the wake of 9/11 because they wanted to build a wall that would make Mexico look like nothing. And we had that there. But what he'd also done is he'd helped change, and I referenced this at the beginning, the definition of who we are, because Canadians had always defined themselves by not being Americans. We're
Right.
not those loud, brash, Americans on the south of the border. That's no definition or affirmation of Canadianism. And he gave us back a sense of identity through that whole process. Arthur, do you have a thought on that?
Well, just free trade would be the prime example. He was confident that we could take on the world, and in this case, the colossus of the world, the United States, and we could not only equal them in many sectors, we could beat them. And that's exactly what has happened. So free
Yeah.
trade was more than an economic trade agreement. It was also a change in Canada's psychology, collective psychology. And he was confident that we would be victorious, and we would follow him. He was already there. He knew we would
Yeah.
catch him. You know.
Well,
But
and Arthur made the point earlier about environmentalists as an
Yeah.
environment. I mean, he literally was a generation ahead.
Right.
Yeah. No, exactly. Everybody who thinks they've just discovered the environment, he
Yeah.
was dealing with it. Okay, I want to have some fun because Arthur made this reference at the beginning, what the Prime Minister would write on a piece of paper, which was holy F exclamation mark. But we also heard some of that stuff come out of his mouth from time to time, even though he would think on the plane that perhaps what was being said was off the record. But I'm just gonna, no horror like an old horror. We was talking about Bryce Mackesy, Bill. It was funny. Everybody laughed. He thought it was funny, but it was a start in the break of the relationship with the media too, in a way, for that to be reported.
Yeah, but the break was because the reference wasn't to Bryce Mackesy. The reference was to himself. Right.
Okay.
What he said, like there was a controversy over Mr. Mackesy accepting a patronage appointment as ambassador to Portugal. And Mr. Mackesy was well known to all of us who were in Montreal at that period. It was a pretty small community on one level. And so we were talking about the appointment and about whether or not he should have accepted it.
Yeah.
And so MBM laughed and said, well, I don't know, I'm not going to be crazy. I mean, I would have taken it. And then he laughed and said, but then again, and then the quote, right? But he was talking about himself, not about Bryce. But
it's not how it was reported. Yeah.
No, well, because it was on an airplane. It was in an unstructured environment. People 2 or 3 rows back thought they heard something, wrote that story, and that's the story that got legs, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, he had a great sense of humor, and he had a pointed reference, and he had, he enjoyed a laugh, and I'll tell you a quick story, just the illustration of the sense of humor, and it's connected directly to Brian and his determination. So we are in the process of organizing his first ever trip to the UK, where he's going to meet the Queen at Buckingham Palace. He had met her in Canada, but not there. So I'm part of the advanced team that's organizing that trip. And at a certain point, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office makes it clear to me that there will be no photo op because Her Majesty only has her picture taken with heads of state and Mr. Mulroney is head of government. So I look at them and I say, let me see if I've got this straight. Are you telling me that the Queen of Canada is not going to have her picture taken with the Prime Minister of Canada? Is that what you're telling me? So in the spirit of Brian, there is no's not an answer. I might even have been a tad aggressive about making my point and a tad aggressive about
not you
making sure that there was a photo op. So that's all well and good, except the Brits leak it that there's this boorish staff guy that, so we're on our way to London. We land. Fleet Street's there. They're all barking about the boors on your staff. So we go to the cars, and normally I did not ride in the car with the Prime Minister and Mrs. Mulroney, but he kind of looked and said, get in the car. So I get in. And he looks at me and he says, now, Bill, you're the press secretary. Is that correct? I said, yes, sir. He said, and it's your job to answer questions about me. I got that correct. Yes, sir. So maybe you could explain to me why I'm answering questions about you.
Yeah, that's a pretty good point.
One of my favorites involves the media as well. And remember, I'm working for him long after he's prime minister.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
every once in a while, he would ask me to phone a reporter.
yeah.
And, at first I would do anything he said. And then I noticed that he'd always get in trouble if I did it. So
Right.
one time we're in Montreal, and at the end of the day, he says, he asked me to call somebody. There's been some story he doesn't like. And finally, I worked up my courage. And I said, no, I'm not doing it. And he looked
Yeah.
at me and he said, he seemed shocked. I said, you're going to get yourself in trouble, and I don't want anything to do with it. And I left. Well, sure enough, the next morning I get up in the hotel, and there's a nice story about Mr. Mulroney. He got himself in a little trouble, and I walk into his study the next day at home, and he says, "Good morning, Arthur." I said, "Good morning, sir." And he said, "Did you happen to see today's press?" I said, "Yes." And there was this really interesting story on page 2. I said, "Wow, what a story that was." And he looked at me, and the rest of my life, I'll never forget that. He said, "Arthur, let that be a lesson to you." And I said, "To me?" He said, "Yes. Always remember that happiness is having a former prime minister boss who's full of shit." That's my favorite. That was one of my favorites.
That is an absolutely great story. You you've both mentioned this, and I've experienced it personally. His heart was as big as this sense of vision. He was kind in the quietest ways to people. We all had a friend, Marjorie Nichols, who was dying of cancer. The prime minister and his wife invited her up to Harrington. They didn't say anything to anybody. They had dinner, and I was seeing Marjorie every day of her life then, helping her through that. It was the kind of the denouement, the most important moment in her life, to have been invited up there, talk politics, and go home. It was, and nobody knew.
Right.
Only Marjorie told me, and that was that. Like, incredible, those kinds of stories.
Well, and a lot at the time, if word leaked out about one of them, there was a tendency
Yeah,
to think, oh, well, that was for political advantage or whatever.
yeah, yeah,
And that kind of sniping falls apart when you think about, and he was still doing it 40 years later, right up
yeah,
till the week,
yes,
the final week,
yeah,
reaching out to friends, always there with a hand, always encouraged by any modest success you might have had in your own life.
yeah.
Always happy to share, always keen to introduce you to interesting people.
Yeah.
He just, he was
Well,
just
it
a
was
special
everything.
guy.
Not only did he sort of help the current government try and save the free trade agreement, he didn't need to do that. Again, he was acting on the part of the country, but also, like, when we've had rough moments, when each of us individually have rough moments in our life, and sometimes they're very public. I was at an event once, and Brian stopped and shook my hand in front of a room of 400 people. And
Right.
I stood up just to, he was just, it was an act of kindness.
Yeah.
Those things are very touching, and you remember them forever. That was my thought when in his last days. Arthur, you must have seen that too in the.
A thousand times, but for me, and I know Bill would have 10 of these stories, and you Pamela, you have some too. But it was the night my father died,
Yeah,
and how he knew about it, I don't know.
yeah,
And I got this call, and him and I had worked on the death of his father. Was a
yeah,
very profound event in his life, and he walked me through this, and I don't know, I can't even describe the talk he uh,
yeah,
gave me. But he didn't have to
yeah,
do it, but B, boy, did it mean something to me that he did.
yeah. Helped heal your heart.
Yeah.
Um, I want to just go to the words of another person. We all know Anthony Wilson Smith, who was writing again about Brian Mulroney this week. And he put it this way, Bill, and I'm so interested to hear your thoughts. He said, for many years, there seemed to be a restlessness in his soul. I'm paraphrasing a bit, a striving, despite all the successes that we know he experienced. But in his later years, it had lifted and there was a peace. Did you see that, Bill? Did you feel that?
Well, I think that the same kind of big vision, bold, decisive, that are the earmarks of his stewardship of the country as prime minister, apply equally to his post-political career in business and in, he was genuinely kind of engaged. But he also, as his family got older, and they in turn started to have families, like the family became an exceptional focus for him.
Yeah.
And he would have spoken to the four kids, Caroline, Ben, Marco, and Nico, literally every day. He delighted in their success. He delighted in the adventures of his grandchildren. He delighted in the adventures of your children and your grandchildren in a very genuine way. And you think statesman, yes, but Super Bowl Sunday, we're sitting in his den with a couple of 100 million other people watching football. So I think as the years went by, there probably were fewer mountains that he felt he had to climb. But boy, he was. I literally was with him the night before the results of the fall, and right on top of his game, he was regaling us with a story from the '83 leadership campaign that he remembered in encyclopedic detail. And but he was thrilled to see how his family was doing. Thrilled to see how yours was doing,
Well, he said, I saw him in January with Bill and with Bonnie, and there was chatting 100% on top of all the issues. And he looked at me at one point and said, so Pam, how's that independent Senate thing going? Right. Just this little wry smile in the corner of his mouth, right? Just 100% on game and humorous. Arthur, your thoughts about the family man and this, he was such a dichotomy, but a mixture. It all melded, right? It all melded.
When Bill and so many of others have said that he spoke to each of his children once a day, he spoke to each of his children once a day. And I would be on the, I would hear his end of things often when we were in his study. And I'm from one of those normal families where nobody likes each other. So I would listen to him. And I would be so jealous. I'd be so jealous of these Mulroneys. But no, very true. And he also, I know Bill would have noticed this many more times than me. He also, I don't know how to put this in words, but he physically changed around his wife and his family. He became softer, more relaxed. You could literally see it, I found.
Yeah.
And it was something else.
And Arthur makes a critical point. Like he and Mila were a partnership in every sense of the word, in every element of their lives. You could not think of one without the other. Starting back, in politics in opposition days. I mean, Mila was a political force in her own right. And when we were campaigning in the 83, 84 period, when we were in opposition, we always ended at a big rally with them together. But during the day, like they worked separate events and one of the elements of Mila's attractiveness as a political a champion for people was the fact that she was an immigrant herself. And so for so many Canadians, she was just somebody that they knew, understood their reality,
their story,
and arguably their their story and therefore their plight, and brought a sympathy to it and an understanding of it and a desire to resolve it that meant a lot to them. And you know, every planning session, every strategic conversation, it was always the two of them together. It was always Brian and Mila.
Partner and advisor, Arthur. Partner and advisor.
Another thing that not a lot of people are aware of, I was fascinated to see Mrs. Mulroney's role in diplomacy.
Yeah.
And there's a certain member of the royal family that she dealt with. He might be king now, who totally was not supposed to be political. And he couldn't do, His Royal Highness couldn't do that with the Prime Minister of Canada. But boy, he might slip a note or two to the spouse of the Prime Minister of Canada. And we put some of those references in the memoirs, but trust me, there were 100 we didn't put in of people who contacted Mrs. Mulroney. And like I said, she was quite a diplomat in her own right.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And gatekeeper. As we just wrap this up today, I'm thinking of the quote, and it's overused and overworked, but Teddy Roosevelt's great line about life in the arena, and I've got it in front of me here, about those who dare greatly and they sometimes fail, but they carry on, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. And it about sums it up for Canada's most incredible Prime Minister. He just fought the fight every day of his life. Bill, you'll miss a friend. Desperately.
You know, we were friends for over 50 years.
Yeah.
You know, there'll never be a day where I don't think of him. And he, you know, apart from everything else, to be intentionally personal for a second, he absolutely changed the trajectory of my life.
Right. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And so how do you say thank you to somebody for that?
Yeah. No, I think that's true. And you experience it too, Arthur. I've got to thank you both so much for this. It's, I think, such a fitting tribute to this man that was funny and tough and changed our world. And we are all forever grateful. Thank you, Bill Fox, Arthur
Thank
Milne.
you.
Thanks.
And we keep the Prime Minister in our thoughts and his family as the country gathers now to pay tribute, to pay their respects for a man who changed our lives. That's it for No Nonsense. We'll see you all again soon.